Good afternoon. Thanks everyone for joining today. We are here and excited to share the findings of 3 in-depth reports focused on the main security challenges to the power sector in the coming years. This event is being recorded and will be posted on the IEA website. After the presentations, we will have time for a question and answer session. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window to propose a question that we will moderate and have some time at the end. At this point, I will turn it over for opening remarks from Keisuke Sadamori, Director of Energy Markets and Security. Over to you, Keisuke.
Thank you, Keith. Good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. But thanks to all of you for joining today. We convene with you to share the insights gained from our work on 3 key aspects of electricity security that will become increasingly relevant in the power system of the future. First, we will present our report on maintaining secure electricity supply in ongoing the energy transitions. This report discusses the need to update the existing framework to ensure system adequacy, flexibility, and stability as fossil fuel-based power systems incorporate increasing share of variable renewables like wind and solar. This report highlights the value of new approaches that recognizes the contribution from all sources to flexibility and adequacy in a fair manner through effective market design and regulations. Second is our analysis on enhancing cyber resilience in the electricity systems, which discuss the opportunities presented by digitalization to accelerate clean energy transitions, along with the need to identify and manage risks to cybersecurity as power systems become more open and interconnected. Third, and finally, the report on climate resilience explains the need to assess and respond to the impact of climate change and extreme weather events to the entire network of electricity and related systems by building resilient infrastructure. These reports build upon the Power Systems in Transition report released at the System Integration of Renewable Resources Ministerial Conference hosted by Singapore in October 2020, last year. Between that event and today, events have conspired to draw electricity security into the spotlight. In January, a cold snap across Northeast Asia triggered fierce competition among Japan, South Korea, and China for limited LNG supplies, driving the spot price of LNG from $7 to around $30 per million BTU. In Japan, for instance, because of this tight LNG market and higher electricity demand, power prices surged and recorded more than $2,000 per megawatt hour in certain regions, and power companies were forced to call for customers to conserve energy to avoid blackouts. Then, in February, the US state of Texas experienced extensive power cuts that left up to 4 million customers without power over a period of 5 days. A historic cold snap drove demand for electricity far beyond the most extreme scenarios envisioned by the system operator, ERCOT. The cold weather also hampered gas production, gas supply due to freezing wells and gathering lines. Gas-fired power plants lost as much as 24 gigawatt out of 55 gigawatt of expected capacity, resulting from both generator equipment failures and the lack of fuel supply. So this event in particular highlights the strong link between the electricity and gas security. A resilient electricity systems requires a resilient gas supply system. In addition, power systems need to be resilient to increasing extreme weather events. Policymakers should address these issues in a coordinated and a coherent fashion with policies that make best use of existing assets and encourage new investments both in supply and demand for flexibility and resource adequacy. Drawing on good practices by countries, these reports provide a set of recommendations for institutional frameworks that establish clear responsibilities, incentives and rules, measures to identify, manage, and mitigate risks, and protocols to monitor progress, respond and recover, including through emergency response exercises. I would like to thank the countries contributing to the IEA in this area. And we will continue working on the topic of electricity security in two ways. First, with our analysis, and second, providing a platform for countries to share their experiences and best practices on the topic. On the analysis part, for instance, the IEA has initiated a major project on the value of using low carbon fuels in the thermal power plants, which will highlight the role that fuels such as biomass, low carbon ammonia, and hydrogen can play in secure energy transitions. On the best practice sharing, this year, the IEA will continue the technical assistance to emerging economies, especially the IEA association countries, through the Clean Energy Transition Program. Finally, last but not least, a special thanks to the European Commission, who made this work possible through funding from the European Union's Horizon 2020 program. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Keisuke, for the opening remarks. Now we will turn to the secure energy transition chapter, and Alejandro Hernandez will present our findings. Alejandro, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Keith. So I will present the most recent analysis of the IEA on the secure energy transitions in the power sector. So first of all, we need to start from this point. The power sector landscape is changing dramatically. The traditional system, which is characterized by centralized dispatchable sources that are providing high levels of inertia and stability, whose investments were decided by central planning, and in which both the energy and the communications were going from the grid to the consumer premises, and where there were very few devices interacting with the network, is changing into a system which is completely different, in which we have large shares of variable generation, much of it at a decentralized level in distribution grids, where a lot of this generation will not be providing inertia, and these systems could become with low system inertia coming from rotating machines, where investments will be derived by multiple actors through competitive markets, and in which the energy and communications will be on two ways flows, from the grid to the consumer premises and backwards. Many devices will be interacting with the grid through open networks. And finally, all this will happen in a context in which extreme weather events will become an increasing threat to the power system. So under these circumstances, it's necessary to understand what changes are needed to keep security of supply. And first of all, we need to get a bit into the detail. We need to understand that there are very different levels and kinds of interruptions depending on the duration and the depth of these interruptions. For instance, very often in the news, we might hear about events like load shedding, which means this is a maneuver from the system operators under exceptional circumstances in which they have to ration electricity to a certain amount of consumers in order to keep real-time balance of the system. In general, this can be, this allows the system operator to keep control of the system. And we have to differentiate this from cascade blackouts. These events often caused by technical failures in which the whole system is lost. No consumer has electricity in the region, and where it might take hours at least, and often days, in order to restore the system. And we have to differentiate this from other kind of energy ration events, which happen, for instance, when there is not enough capacity to provide energy to the whole system during long periods. So in this figure, what we have depicted in the bubbles the amount of energy that has been lost in different events during the recent years. In the bottom left, we have events like those that have happened in Alberta between 2006 and 2013, which are pretty small. And this is pretty much how the system, the power system should work, actually. It's not that there are never outages, but there are a few, and they are very small, and they affect a very small amount of customers. And in the x-axis, what we have is the number of hours of these events. And in the y-axis, what we have is the depth of this, the amount of demand that had to be shed. On the top left of the figure, what we have is cascade blackouts that were caused mainly by technical failures. These events are like the one in South Australia in 2016, on Pakistan in this year, and in Hokkaido in 2018. This is the kind of outage or blackout in which the system operators are more used to, due, for instance, for transmission lines tripping. But this technical failure is not the only source of outages. The lack of proper investment has brought South Africa to a very large amount of outages during 2020. And if you can see, the number, it seems relatively small, is less than 1% of the electricity, is 0.6% of the electricity demand that has not been served. But this already creates a lot of economic damage to the country. Finally, the most recent event that we must highlight is the one on Texas in February of this year, caused by a very unusual weather event, in which almost 0.4% of the electricity demand was unserved. This looks, again, like a very small number, but created not only economic damages, but the worst, lives that were lost. So it is more important than ever for us to understand the critical role of electricity security for our economies and how this threat landscape is changing. So I would like to remind very quickly why the electricity is a special sector and why we need reliability standards. In other markets, what happens when there is a supply shortage, basically, prices do their work and they allow to allocate demand to supply. This is not possible in electricity because it's very small amount of consumers' real-time responsiveness. So policymakers have the task to provide a amount of how much it is acceptable. And this is what we call the reliability standards. But these standards, they are never perfect. They are individual metrics. For instance, the loss of load expectation is an average frequency measure, but actually it doesn't measure how many customers are affected or how much energy is not served. On the other hand, measures based on energy, like the average energy not served, does not consider the potential damage of the energy that is not served, because it's not the same to ration energy to one consumer during one day than rationing 24 consumers during an hour. The damage could be much larger, actually, for a few amount of consumers that are left in the dark during many hours, as it happened in Texas, actually. So the first step is to consider what are these reliability standards, and for policymakers to understand if these standards, they are good, they reflect properly the society preference and needs. The next step is that we need to understand that reduced costs will make for variable renewables the fastest growing source of electricity in the coming years. And this is an excellent news. But the variability and uncertainty that comes with these sources will require updates in the market frameworks and also new ways to operate the system. In advanced economies, currently, the deployment of large shares of renewables has happened with the backup of large amounts of a thermal fleet. This thermal fleet is going to be retired in the coming years. So what will happen is that more and more natural gas and coal plants will reduce the number of hours in which they are running on full load. And this is, once again, a very good news. And under scenarios that are compatible with our shared climate goals, this will go even further. So what is needed? First of all, there will be other sources of flexibility. In each region, these sources will be different, but demand side response and storage coming both from batteries and from hydro will have a larger role in balancing the system. But for that to happen, we have to acknowledge two things. First of all, that there are many services that are needed to keep security of supply. In this figure, we have divided this in 4 services: energy, peak capacity or adequacy, to be more broad, flexibility and ramping, and stability. And currently, most of these services are provided by the thermal fleets. This is an exercise that was done for the ASEAN countries by the IEA. And in the left figure, we can see that most of these services are provided by thermal services. The picture on the right is a figure with large shares of variable renewables, which is much more colorful, of course. But the idea is that energy could come from variable resources, but we have to be sure that the other services that need to keep security of supply will be there. And more important, that the markets and the investment frameworks, they properly recognize the value of those services to the system. Variable renewables will bring new changes also on the way we plan the system and how we measure adequacy and reliability. In the figure, what we have is an exercise done by the IEA and that you can find in our report, in which we use stochastic methods in order to provide a much more detailed figure on what is the adequacy in China under different scenarios. In this exercise, we take 18 different climate years, and we have more than 1,000 simulated samples. And this provides a very good figure on where are the sources of stress to the system. And more important, what is the contribution of different type of resources to adequacy under different scenarios. They could be dispatchable, or they can be renewable, or they can be batteries, but the contribution of these kind of sources can be properly assessed. For many systems that will rely on gas in order to keep adequacy in the coming years, the picture is getting a bit more complex as well. This is, in the figure, we can see an exercise that you can find as well in our report, in which we model the effects of a cold spell on electricity demand in 2030 in Northwest Europe, once a lot of the coal phase outs has already happened. And although we expect that a reduced demand of gas at that year in Europe, the role of gas will be increasingly important in order to fulfill the adequacy. And it's not only that the gas is going to be more important, but also the role of the gas infrastructure will be more relevant for policymakers. There are some things, there are some technical parameters like delivery rates and flexibility of the gas system that will be need to be understood by the European power sector, and not only the European, North American, and many other systems, regulators and system planners and system operators, in order for us to understand what is the adequacy and the threats that could come from disruptions from gas or from infrastructure. In one word, policymakers, they will need to get gas savvy. They will get, the more we rely on gas, the more we will need to understand how the gas system works. Finally, the cross-border trading will be more relevant than ever. The generation of clean energy, such as wind, solar, and hydro, will be much easier and will be happening at a lower cost the more integrated the power sectors of different regions are. And this is because we will take advantage of complementarity, both of the supply side coming from various resources and from the demand side, something that we already knew. Cross-border trading is not only a question of wires, it's not a question of figures, of having a new line. It's also on having power systems that get more integrated and that whose operations they talk to each other, which makes it much easier to take advantage of our shared resources. Having said that, I would like to thank all the team that has been involved in this effort, and I give you back the floor, Keith. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Alejandro. Now turning to cyber resilience, presenting our findings will be George Camilla, Energy Policy Analyst with the Strategic Initiatives Office of the IEA. George, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Keith. I'll just share my screen once. There we go. I hope you can all see that now. So thank you so much, Keith. A big thank you to my co-authors as well, Sophia, Enrique, Jason, and Edwin, and many external reviewers and experts who provided excellent input for this report. So today I'll try to provide a bit of a brief overview of the chapter, but do encourage everyone tuning in to download the full 80-page report to see all the details. As we heard earlier, the electricity system is undergoing several major transformations, one of which is digitalization. The pace of digitalization is accelerating across all sectors, thanks to rapidly improving performance and falling costs. Since 2010, internet connection speeds have increased by more than 10 times. Costs of data storage and IoT sensors have fallen by more than half. In the electricity system, generation assets are becoming increasingly digitalized through sensors and automation, while investments in smart grids have been growing steadily over the past few years. Many countries around the world are rolling out smart meters, while consumers and businesses are adopting more and more connected devices, such as smart thermostats and appliances. Over the next decade, the total number of connected devices is expected to more than double from around 20 billion today to nearly 50 billion by 2030. Digital technologies offer many opportunities that could benefit electricity consumers, utilities, and the system as a whole. Digitalization can improve efficiency, reduce O&M costs, reduce outage times, and extend the operational lifetime of assets. These savings could total around $80 billion per year, or about 5% of annual power generation costs today. Digital technologies can also play a key role in accelerating clean energy transitions. For example, connected devices and other smart grid technologies can improve energy efficiency, help unlock demand response resources, and integrate higher shares of variable renewables. But increasing digitalization comes with growing risks as well. The rapid growth in connected devices is expanding the potential cyber attack surface of electricity systems. And greater connectivity and automation can make these systems more vulnerable to attacks and impacts. Several electricity-related cyber incidents were reported publicly in 2020, but many incidents may not be reported or even detected. Differences in what constitutes an attack or an incident could also lead to very different measurements. Nonetheless, it is clear that threat actors are becoming increasingly sophisticated, both at carrying out attacks in terms of their ability to identify vulnerabilities and their destructive capabilities. There are many ways that an attacker could compromise an electricity system. For example, attackers could use a virus to infiltrate an industrial control system through USB flash drives or compromised firmware updates. Attackers could also use supply chain vulnerabilities to compromise equipment and devices well before they're installed in electricity systems. A successful cyber attack could trigger the loss of control over devices and processes, in turn causing physical damage and widespread service disruption. In addition to the impacts on critical services, households and businesses that rely on electricity, an attack could also result in millions or even billions of dollars in damages for electric utilities. While the full prevention of attacks is not possible, electricity systems must become more cyber resilient, that is, to withstand, adapt to, and rapidly recover from attacks. Enhancing the cyber resilience of electricity systems is a continuous process involving several stages. 1, identifying and assessing risks and preparedness. 2, implementing risk management strategies to prioritize risks and actions. And in the event of an attack, following robust response and recovery procedures. 4, documenting and incorporating lessons learned. And finally, sharing knowledge with other stakeholders. And because cyber threats are constantly evolving, all organizations need to continuously work on enhancing their resilience. These fundamental principles of cyber resilience are applicable across sectors and industries, but need to be tailored to account for sector-specific characteristics and needs. For the electricity system, this means taking into account real-time requirements, cascading effects within and across systems, and dealing with a mix of new technologies and legacy assets. Policymakers are central to enhancing the cyber resilience of electricity systems. In the report, we highlight 5 key areas in which policymakers working with industry and other stakeholders can enhance the cyber resilience of electricity systems. For example, to help identify risks, market participants in Australia are invited to self-assess their capabilities. This exercise provides participants with clarity on which areas to focus on and prioritize cybersecurity investments. There are many existing risk management tools, security frameworks, technical measures, and self-assessment approaches available to help policymakers and industry implement cyber resilience measures. Around the world, a number of evolving policy approaches to cyber resilience have already been adopted. These can be categorized on a scale ranging from highly prescriptive approaches with specific mandatory requirements to less prescriptive, performance-oriented framework-based approaches. More prescriptive approaches have the benefit of setting clear requirements, effectively setting a minimum level across networks. But this risks overly focusing on compliance, checking the boxes, so to speak, rather than focusing on the risks themselves. Moreover, prescriptive approaches are challenged by the need to keep pace with ever-evolving technologies and new risks that may emerge. Less prescriptive framework-based approaches have the benefit of focusing on outcomes, fostering customized approaches that evolve along with the risks. But if the approach is too conceptual, it can rely too much on voluntary initiatives of stakeholders, leaving some weak links in a system that is interconnected digitally, electrically, and by supply chains. Setting effective cyber resilience regulation is therefore a delicate balancing act between enforcement and innovation. And these should be tailored to national circumstances while considering the global nature of risks. In summary, digitalization can help to accelerate clean energy transitions by improving energy efficiency, unlocking more demand response opportunities, and integrating greater shares of variable renewables. But increased digitalization could raise risks to cybersecurity. Cyber resilience, therefore, needs to be a critical component of clean energy transitions. The electricity system has a unique set of operational conditions and requirements, vulnerabilities, and solutions compared to other sectors. Enhancing the cyber resilience of electricity systems therefore requires tailored policies and strategies. Energy policymakers have a critical role to play in enhancing cyber resilience across the electricity system, beginning with raising awareness and working with stakeholders to continuously identify, manage, and communicate emerging risks and vulnerabilities. Policymakers are also well placed to play a central role in facilitating partnerships and sector-wide collaboration, information exchange programs, and research initiatives across the electricity sector and beyond. The report contains much more details, and I'd encourage everyone tuning in today to download and read all the examples that we've provided. Thank you.
Thanks very much, George. Turning to our third report, focused on climate resilience, we have Jinsun Lim, Energy and Environment Policy Analyst with Energy and Climate Change, and Craig Hart, Energy Analyst with Renewables Integration and Secure Electricity. Jinsun and Craig, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Keith. I will share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Not yet, Jinsun.
Okay. Can you see
There
my
it is.
now?
There it is. Great. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for introduction, Keith. I would like to talk about another new threat to electricity security. As you all know, that during the latest years, the electricity system has witnessed increasing pressure from climate change. The latest decade was the warmest decade on record. We are observing more variable precipitation patterns. Extreme weather events became the new normal as well. I believe our time will be defined by how to address and cope with the adverse impacts of climate change on electricity systems. While we are doing the research, we found that climate change directly affects every segment of the electricity system. It impacts generation potential and efficiency, physical resilience of electricity networks, and demand patterns. In many countries, the increasing frequency or intensity of extreme weather events, such as heat waves, cold waves, wildfires, cyclones, and floods are the dominant cause of large-scale outages. As other speakers already mentioned, the recent outages due to heat wave in California, cold wave in Texas, and wildfires in Australia demonstrate that electricity systems are already exposed to climate hazards. The table on this slide summarizes the climate impacts on each segment of the electricity system. You can see that how 4 major changes in climate, such as rising global temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, sea level rise, and more frequent or intense extreme weather events can affect electricity generation, transmission, and distribution and demand. I would like to hand it over to my colleague, Mr. Craig Hart, to explore more in detail about the climate impacts.
Thanks, Jinsun. So just to build on that, so in this report, we explored these various impacts of the climate on the electricity system. And these are in terms of the long-term impacts coming from gradual changes in the climate that occur over many years. And then, of course, these short-term impacts from the extreme weather events. Now, concerning the impacts on electricity systems, these long-term impacts, increasing temperatures is one of the major sort of ones of these that are having an impact on the electricity system. Increasing temperatures have an impact across the entire electricity value chain. You see on generation, it can lead to decreased efficiency of generation plants. On transmission and distribution systems, you have affecting the limits, the operational limits of the system due to the thermal derating of lines, transformers, and other components, as well as on demand, leading to an increased cooling demand and refrigeration demand. On this side, we see, for example, as regions with traditionally cooler climates start to experience a large enough window of hotter days, this could lead to an installation of individual air conditioning units, which increases then the demand in the residential sector and can drive new sources of system peak demand, which of course then drive the need for increased generation capacity. As we see on the slide at the bottom here, there's an example of some analysis in the report which looks at how residential cooling consumption is projected to increase by 65% towards 2030 compared to 2018. Under the WEO stated policy scenario, this is mostly driven by increasing purchasing power of non-OECD countries in some of the hottest and most humid regions of the world. And if we look on the right, the figure on the right, we see that these regions are also those which are expected to have the highest change in cooling needs due to climate change. And so we can see that that this can be, of course, a major driver for capacity needs in the system. Of course, if we also look in the figure on the right, on the left, we see that through a combination of more efficient devices and buildings, increased flexibility, this can be cut by almost 20% in the sustainable development scenario. And this shows the potential of energy efficiency to increase climate resilience of the system with regards to these changing temperatures. Another long-term impact explored in this report is the changing precipitation patterns, which will impact the water availability both at a geographical and a seasonal level. And while this can impact on the demand side, it can drive, for example, new end uses such as desalination plants. Its most notable impact would be on the supply side. An obvious example being that of hydrogeneration, but equally at risk are thermal plants, as many will use fresh water as a coolant for generation. And in this case, water shortages could cause water-cooled thermal plants to reduce output capacity or to even shut down completely, actions that may last for weeks, if not months, and have a vast impact on the systems in which this occurs. And here we see another example of some analysis in the report, just a snapshot of it, which tries to highlight those countries whose thermal fleet is most at risk. So looking at the national share of thermal plants which are using freshwater cooling, but also on the right where it's showing which of these plants are using freshwater cooling, but are also in regions which have a high water stress. And also this is both in terms of existing water stress, but also then looking at climate projections and how this may impact the water stress of thermal plants in the future for these countries. Going to the next slide, one of the last of the long-term climate impacts that we explore in this report is that of sea level rise, where we see that global sea levels are now rising at almost double the pace that were observed during the 20th century. And this can have an impact on coastal infrastructure, especially as it can cause floods and erosion of natural barriers. And this threatens the infrastructure in coastal regions in many countries around the world. Now, the analysis, again, from the report that is presented here, looks specifically at the location of existing conventional power plants, and how these may be affected by 1 in 100-year surge levels, coastal surge levels, under a scenario where we see 1.1 meters level of sea level rise. And this is relative to 2015 levels, which represents the upper range of current projections for sea level rise at the end of the century. And while this analysis is simplified in many manners, what it does try to do is paint a picture of how desperate the impacts of sea level rise will be on global electricity systems, showing how very particular countries or regions even, if we see on the right, there's particular regions which are severely impacted, how sea level rise affects these particular countries and particular regions which are coastal and both low-lying. Going to the next slide. While the aforementioned climate impacts that we're looking at were gradually changing over the long term, these were also changing the environment in which this is also changing the general climatic conditions in which extreme weather events are happening and where they're occurring more frequently and more intense. And these, of course, then provide a much more sudden and immediate impact or test on the resilience of our electricity systems. So one of this can be in terms of, and this has been explored already in some of the earlier presentations, but examples being the cold spells, heat waves, and droughts, which impact demand or generation availability, or cyclones and floods, which damage transmission and distribution equipment. And then also extreme weather related events being wildfires, which are damaging transmission and distribution equipment, leading to multiple simultaneous faults, which of course then cause outages. And also then the de-energized lines, which to prevent further wildfires, looking at transmission or distribution systems as a cause the wildfires, as we see in California in the last few years. So if we look at the bottom of the slide, one of the analyses from the report explores the drivers of these fires and their relationship with the distribution networks, which are particularly exposed to extreme weather events because of these events being occurring over large geographical areas. And then you have the large geographical footprint of transmission and distribution networks. And so this analysis looks at both how fire seasons have widened in many regions over the last decades, which you see on the figure on the right, but also how the vegetation surrounding distribution networks can also be a major factor, both in terms of how it's an added challenge for distribution system operators, for vegetation management around the network to avoid sparking fires, but also because trees in forested regions provides a fuel for these fires, which can lead to more intense wildfires than grass or shrubs, and can then be very difficult for firefighters to combat. And of course, all these impacts then have that I've explored highlight this growing need for climate resilience in the electricity system, both from that we've seen in the past, but then of course also looking towards the future. And this is something which Jin-Sun will explore further in the following slides. So back to you, Jin-Sun.
Thank you very much, Craig. So we would like to talk about how we can address the potential and existing impacts of climate change on electricity systems. So we would like to highlight that we already seeing that more actors are now discussing climate resilience. So climate resilience is the ability to anticipate, absorb, and accommodate and recover from the effects of a potentially hazardous events related to climate change. So IEA developed a conceptual framework, as you can see in the slide, to describe the concept of climate resilience better. It consists of three main dimensions: robustness, resourcefulness, and recovery. Robustness is the ability of an energy system to withstand the gradual long-term changes in climate patterns and continue operation. Resourcefulness is the ability to continue operation during immediate shocks such as extreme weather events. Recovery is the ability to restore the system's function after an interruption resulting from climate hazards. So, for example, a more resilient electricity system with a well-coordinated contingency plan for communications or temporary assets and the workforce will recover faster from the interruptions caused by climate impacts. In this report, we explored some potential benefits of climate resilience. We found that climate resilience not only provides a cost-effective solution for electricity security, but also supports a delivery of development and climate goals. First of all, climate resilience of electricity systems have become increasingly important to ensure secure electricity supply. We have found recent studies from the UN and the World Bank all suggest that the benefits of resilient electricity systems are much larger than the cost of building them. For instance, in Bangladesh, a country which is highly prone to floods, additional flood protection could save up to more than $1 billion. In California, where wildfires are a major threat, good forest maintenance can minimize the cost of wildfire on transmission and distribution lines. Second, adopting climate resilience measures contribute to achieving universal electricity access. Well, we can imagine that future changes in climate may significantly limit progress towards universal electricity access by restricting resource availability, reducing generation efficiency, and also increasing the likelihood of outage. We've already seen some cases, for example, in Zambia, where only 30 to 40% of the population has access to electricity, is already adversely affected by climate change. In February 2016, the water level of the Kariba Dam, the biggest electricity source in Zambia, dropped by 88%, prompting blackouts. The disruption occurred again in August 2019. So adopting climate resilience measures would help countries like Zambia ensure reliable access to electricity. The third one is that climate resilient electricity systems support the clean energy transitions. For clean energy transition, we expect the increasing electrification of heating, transport, and other sectors, which means that a failure to manage climate impacts in the electricity sector could have widespread destructive consequences. To ensure the delivery of all the benefits, the report suggests a 6-step guidance to build and enhance climate resilience of electricity systems. In the proposed sequential application of measures for climate resilience, all stakeholders are expected to play a key role. However, in particular, policymakers will have a critical role to play. Effective policy measures can prevent potential market failure, collaborating with other stakeholders. The step-by-step guidance, as you can see on the slide, proposed in the report aims to help policymakers and other key actors consider climate resilience in their decision-making process. It suggests assessing climate risks and impacts, making climate resilience central to energy and climate plans, identifying cost-effective measures, creating appropriate incentives, implementing resilience measures efficiently, and evaluating them for effectiveness. Among the 6-step recommendation, I would like to elaborate more about the second step on making climate resilience central to energy and climate plans. National plans that include climate resilience as a core element can send a strong signal to utilities and investors and also developers to strengthen the resilience in the design, operation, and maintenance phases. Moves to integrate climate resilience into national plans can be found worldwide in various forms. However, levels of commitment in progress considerably vary across the world. We found electricity systems in the national climate plans are often considered only in terms of mitigation, such as carbon emission reduction measure, not in adaptation aspects. For instance, only 22 out of 38 IEA countries consider the energy sector as one of the priorities in their national climate adaptation strategies or plans. If the scope is narrowed down to the electricity sector, as you can see on the right side, the variation among countries becomes more marked. Only 9 countries included concrete actions on climate adaptation and resilience for every segment of electricity systems, covering generation, transmission and distribution, and demand. So as a global energy authority, we will continue working on this topic, providing support for building climate resilience in the electricity sector. Please check our website to find more about our work on climate resilience and electricity security. I also would like to especially thank all the internal and external contributors and reviewers for their valuable input to this report. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Jinsun and Craig, for that presentation. We will turn to the question and answer session in a minute. I would encourage all of you who are watching and listening to submit your questions through the Q&A function. Just a quick couple of points on the presentations and the reports. The reports will be available following this event at our website, IEA.org. There is an electricity security homepage where you can find all of these reports in depth. And in addition, the slides, the presentations will also be shared at a later today or tomorrow. So now we will turn to the Q&A. And so please start. We have opened the floor for questions. Thanks. I see some coming in here. Lorenzo Christoph has a question on what do you see the role for island and capable microgrids in climate resilience? So that one would be for Jinsun and Craig.
Thank you very much, Keith, and thank you very much for the question, Lorenzo. Yes, we are actually looking at the grid's role very importantly. So sometimes some of the location, we cannot really say that the island capable microgrids would be the solution for everyone. We always emphasize that because all the countries and regions are facing different type of climate impacts. So some of the regions might find more solutions about the interconnection between the grids, but some of the regions would be able to find out some more isolated capable microgrids or off-grid type of solutions. So I would like to emphasize, yes, microgrids could be a solution for the climate resilience, but it should be applied given the comprehensive assessment of the climate risks and impacts based on the scientific and climate models. Thank you.
Thanks, Jinsun. Moving along.
Sorry, Keith, if I may.
Yes.
Just to add to what Jinsun just said. This is a very interesting opportunity coming from distributed resources. And because nowadays there are already many examples of, for instance, universities who have already a small generation that could be able to coordinate a certain amount of resources, backup diesel generators, etc. So this is certainly one interesting area that we think this should be looked at, because at the end, these resources, you don't want to use them every day or for the wholesale market, but it's a shame not to use them when you face one of these situations. And the technology is pretty much there. And very often the resources are already there. So it's certainly one area of opportunity to face extreme weather events.
Great, thanks. The next question is from Sean O'Brien, and he wants to know how can we best ensure gas deliverability during cold spells. So I think I'll turn that over to Alejandro for a response on that.
Thanks so much, Keith. So there is a lot of, right now, a lot of debate on how it should be done. After what happened in Texas, it's really one of the questions that we should consider carefully. Certainly there are two parts. Well, a lot of the debate is going into how much it should be market-based or how much it should be a regulated sector. We consider ourselves very pragmatical. It should happen certainly by both frameworks. We certainly see a lot of a big role for system operators to understand what are the threats or the needs coming from the gas sector. I'm sure the terms of winterization has already come up to the minds of everyone. And who should, at which point should we say, okay, there should be a standard in order for this kind of facility to be upgraded? And who should pay for that? It could be a regulatory question, certainly. But the main point is for the system to be aware of what are all these threats. It's not, and I think there are 2 points. First of all, sure, you have to understand who is the most efficient stakeholder to pay for that, who should assess this risk. But beyond that, I think the message also is not to prepare only for the last battle. We should not only focusing on that. That shouldn't happen again, for sure. But it's also how do we prepare for these extreme weather events? No, and certainly it should be part of our market mechanisms, and certainly there is a lot of planning and forecasting this kind of preparing for this kind of events.
And if I may, Keith.
Sorry, Cascade, go ahead.
Thanks to the very good question from Sean. And I think I would like to add that it's not only about the gas availability, but the electricity market systems would need generation diversity. So we also need to take a look at the kind of a need and potential for the ensuring the generation diversity, looking at the other the power generation sources, including nuclear, or some kind of the wise use of existing coal-fired power assets. So I just wanted to add to that point. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Cascade. I will turn to Christian Zinglerson. Baser has a question on demand side flexibility. The question reads, with a rapid decrease in thermal generation in several jurisdictions, including Europe, more demand side participation would seem key to preserve not just system stability in the short term, but also broader flexibility in the multi-hour, perhaps even multi-day timeframe. As a global energy authority, do you see emerging best practice from certain jurisdictions around the world in this case? I guess we'll go back to Alejandro for this.
Yes, thank Christian. I'm not sure we can say that there is best practice, but for sure we have seen good examples, both in market-based systems and in vertically integrated utilities, making good use of demand-side response in order to have more flexibility in the systems. So PJM certainly, for instance, is a good example that it comes to mind, where existing water heaters are being used to in order to provide frequency control, which is a very valuable service in the system. And this is also being used in Canadian vertically integrated utilities in the far north. So I think there are these are systems in which, for the time being, often there is still a lot of flexibility coming from the thermal sources, but we see that there are good markets that allow small resources to be represented in markets in such a way that they can provide these for these services. No, it could be as detailed as frequency response, no, but even for load shaving or load following. So there are many ways that this can be done, but very often we'll go through the use of very small resources that can be coordinated, often by aggregators, and that can interact in a smart way with the system.
Thank you. I will turn to George for this next question. It's about cybersecurity. And Mr. Merkebu Degefa, sorry if I mispronounced that, asks, how do you see the role of a laboratory-based testing for cybersecurity vulnerability assessments? And what about standards for security requirements for smart operation functions?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I guess, needs to be considered within the kind of broader set of, training and skills development infrastructure that needs to set up. We don't go into too much depth on this in the report, but I think we do have some references related to this, but happy to chat offline as well about this.
Great, thanks. There are a number of questions related to this topic on resilience. And essentially, the questions boil down to what is the point at which a system cannot or should not become resilient enough against all types of threats, and how do you do that cost-benefit analysis in trying to protect from low-frequency, high-impact events? So why don't we start with Jin-Sun and Craig for this answer?
Thank you very much. That's a really great question. And also we have received very similar questions from many our experts and our reviewers and also our contributors about the cost-benefit analysis. There are some actions from the climate communities to think about, to integrate the climate risk into the investment and also the considering some climate finance and also the investments. So for example, the TCFD, there is a task force to look at the financial disclosure of climate informations. And also there is increasing requests about from the utilities and project developers. They would like to consider the potential climate impacts into their cost-benefit analysis. So actually we are thinking about how we can contribute to this kind of discussion, global discussion, and increasing interest on this topic. So we would like to work on this topic, but until now we haven't really developed a very concrete example, but we hope that we can provide it soon. Oh,
thanks. Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, and related to the other questions about what kind of this kind of low frequency events and their impact on the electricity system. So what we should do and what will be the most vulnerable one to this kind of climate change. My answer would be that the comprehensive and scientific climate risk assessment for each location should be the starting point and the foundation when they are developing the long-term climate and energy plans. So each country should determine that what kind of technology would be best suitable for this location and would be the best resilient option for everyone. So some of the countries might consider some diversification of energy technology, so to ensure that secure electricity supply can be met given the increasing changes in the climate conditions. Thank you.
Thanks. Does anybody else on the panel want to respond to this one? Okay. Question back to George on cyber regulations. Odd Van Boven asks, you mentioned two types of cybersecurity regulations. Which one does the IEA prefer? And does the IEA have capabilities to help countries improve help countries improving?
So yeah, thanks Keith, thanks Odd. Yeah, in the report we kind of discussed that there are these kind of two ends of the spectrum. Countries are choosing to balance their particular circumstances, electricity markets, the mix of participants in their countries, and their, for instance, connections with other countries as well. So I think it's really a case-by-case basis, and the report really highlights some examples of countries along the spectrum and how they're going about designing regulation that is appropriate for their situation. But yeah, like I mentioned in the slides, we're all interconnected electricity systems, so there's a need to both maintain a minimum level of security, across actors and across jurisdictions, but also while taking into account the circumstances. Thanks.
Great, thank you, George. I'll move on to a question about from Mr. Siobhan Powell, who asks, how are you thinking on the aspect of system inertia and frequency control while in the context of high penetration of renewables, and also in this, and can batteries replace peak generation like gas? So maybe Alejandro, you can respond to that one.
Yes. Well, it depends on what is the service we are talking about. As I mentioned, it's not only about energy, and it's a bit more sophisticated than that. So we will need ramping to be an adequacy that basically is to be available when in the moments of stress of the system. We might need inertia. Well, we need inertia for sure, but we need many other things like black start, etc. So I would challenge the question in the sense that we are not comparing one technology against another one. It's not batteries against gas plants. It is a fleet with respect to another fleet, to another. So in general, what we need to do is to understand what is the whole amount of services that we need, and with all the potential the technologies that will happen, how does this fit? So it's not one-to-one technology, and they are not providing the same. For instance, batteries, right now they are being built for 2 hours duration, maybe 4, and that's it. Something that you don't have with a gas. Of course, a gas plant does not have that problem. And of course, you have with gas, we have rotating masses. The question is, how does the rest of the system look like? Do we have nuclear? Do we have enough hydro? Do we have? So maybe you have enough inertia in the system actually, and besides there are other points. It's true that you might not be providing inertia, but you might have other synthetic inertia, and there is a certain amount of this that can be provided by variable resources and by batteries. And inertia and fast frequency response, they can be at some point substitutes unless you get very low levels. So once again, it's not a question on one against the other. It's you have to look at the system, at your real system needs. So I would leave it there.
Great, thanks.
If I may add, our recent report, jointly developed with the RTE, the French system operator, we released a report last month. Was it last month? Or in February, on the kind of technical requirements for integrating very high share of renewables, and that covers these are technical aspects, including the system inertia with very high share of the non-synchronous, the renewable sources. So I would encourage you to read the report. There are some kind of detailed explanations as to what would be required in order to integrate a very high share of non-synchronous the energy sources. Thank you.
Thanks, Cascade. We have time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. So I think this one could be for George. The question involves the blockchain applications. Are there blockchain applications being used in the clean energy transition, and if and in what ways are they used? And does the blockchain lessen cybersecurity risk?
Thanks. It's a great question. I haven't been following the blockchain space recently, but I'm aware of applications for electricity trading in local grids, certifying renewable energy certificates, that kind of application, EV charging, and I think at least a couple of years ago, we were still in the situation where we were trying to figure out, or I guess blockchain companies were trying to figure out what the appropriate applications, what the value added of blockchain was for electricity systems. I'm not sure if that's advanced since, but in terms of cybersecurity, I'm not sure that it enhances or raises any particular risk on blockchain. from blockchain, but it's worth exploring whether there are benefits on that side as well. Perhaps more to do with data privacy issues rather than the risk to the system.
Thanks, George. I think maybe two more. This one's from Richard Laverne, and he mentions that one of the reports mentions the decrease of dispatchable generation capacity in many countries, and that by 2030 that will require adequate deployment of flexible resources. But he says, however, there is no guarantee of success since technologies does not seem to be ready, and social acceptance may be a handicap. I think he's specifically referring to demand side flexibility here. Should governments be prepared to organize rationing by 2030, like we're doing for COVID vaccines? I can maybe Alejandro talk about sort of particularly how we can organize demand side response in a way that's beneficial for both the customer and the system.
Thanks, and thanks, Richard, for the provocative question. No, I think that we are not to a point in which we will say there should be rationing in 2030, or there's not investment coming. There is a different. We have to be very careful on when we think in which kind of systems we are thinking. We are thinking on advanced economies, which have very low demand, electricity demand growth. We are thinking on emerging economies with very large demand growth. Regarding the OECD countries, it's true there is not a large share of investment. There is not big investment, but there is still a lot of flexibility in the system. And for instance, there is a lot of expectation of new technologies like coming from batteries. And there is a lot of demand side that is not being used right now. It's not being used because there is no lack of flexibility right now. So we are quite confident that with well-designed investment frameworks, and as long as we remunerate properly these services called adequacy, flexibility or ramping, etc., investment frameworks, they have managed to keep enough resources in the power system to fulfill the needs of the electricity sector. And we are confident that this will still be the case as long as we keep on evolving our market frameworks. So as long as we are aware of what are the needs of the system and we know that these services are still remunerated, we are confident that the investments should be coming.
Thanks, Alejandro. I think maybe we'll have one more question, and then we'll have to end it after that. I'll choose the question from Mr. Wittenstein. Matt Wittenstein asks, what solutions should small island nations and other isolated systems look to increase resilience, in particular given the rising number of extreme weather events that these countries face? So perhaps Craig or Jin-Sun could start on that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind responding to that first. I think, well, I mean, there's obviously been many examples of how the climate can impact these systems. Just in recent years, just if we look at cyclones in the Caribbean, for example, and in a way, the future-proofing of these systems in terms of the transmission distribution system is one aspect which sees it heavily exposed. So if you have, for example, when Puerto Rico system was damaged from this was it Hurricane Maria, and it took out a transmission line which was heavily exposed going across the island and pretty much devastated the whole system, and that led to the loss of power for well, more than many weeks. It was many months for many people. So I think by doing proper climate risk assessment and impact assessment, and to identify where your system is most heavily exposed to these sort of risks, that's a first start. Of course, this is also looking at the system from being operated in a very centralized manner, more traditional with your various utility scale conventional power plants. And of course, I think it's been touched on a bit earlier today. Distributed systems or microgrids can obviously offer another alternative to try to sort of offer some resilience to these sort of events, both in terms of trying to get the system up and running again, but also making certain parts of critical infrastructure that can rely on these microgrids. They're obviously more resilient, so you can keep your basic sort of services up and running. But I think definitely a diversity in power supply transition from maybe traditional fuels, which are also, let's remember, when you are impacted by, let's say, cyclones or other sort of extreme weather events, can devastate more than just your electricity system, your port structures. Let's say it would be LNG terminals or your diesel sort of receiving terminals. So this can then devastate any other electricity generating infrastructure that is relying on these fields. So I think a transition to distributed clean energy resources also stands to make these systems more resilient and less reliant on infrastructure that is possibly at higher risk of being damaged in these sort of extreme weather events.
Thanks so much, Craig. Unless there are any objections from the panel, I think I will close the Q&A here. So thanks to all of you who have participated with your questions, and thanks to the panelists for the excellent answers. I would again encourage all of you to go to our website, IEA.org, and go to the electricity security homepage, where these reports, along with the presentations today and the recording of today's event, will be posted within the next day or so. And we encourage you to continue to participate with the IEA as we continue looking at these aspects of electricity security and others going forward. So thanks all to participating, and have a great day.